Hi, I'm Michael Goodson, and I'm the Chief Curator and Director of Programming at the Contemporary Dayton in Dayton, Ohio. We have actually just finished presenting Sara Cwynar's soft film. A little bit about Sara. She has her MFA from Yale University and her undergraduate degree from York University in Toronto, and has also studied English literature at the University of British Columbia. She shows at Foxy Production in New York and at The Approach in London, and has had several exhibitions there. My first experience with Sara's work was one that really found a point of purchase for me. I was completely unfamiliar with your work, Sara, until I was in Basel, at Basel, Switzerland, and saw soft film, and I just really kept watching it over and over and over again. And I'll start the conversation there, because I think the very moment that I walked in to the film was very, very important in terms of it finding that point of purchase, because it was quite literally the moment where you correct what is clearly a hired narrator on his pronunciation of the word palimpsest.
What is that? Pamphlicets?
Palimpsest.
Palimpsest. As pamphlicets
of objects, the way you can control them.
And that was an interesting moment for me, for you to. It set the kind of power dynamic that was going on between narrator and really ostensibly you, and I became immediately aware and fascinated by that. I mean, and then all the other information that is conflated with that also became very fascinating to me. But I ended up watching the film over and over again. And actually, when I was the curator at the Wexner Center, I advocated to have the film presented there in various contexts, but it didn't seem to happen, and then COVID came, and then nothing seemed to happen for a while. But I have, in the interim, had the great privilege of watching soft film probably 100 times now. And I'd like to start with talking about soft film. And I suppose you can talk about it in terms of how it relates to the other films, Rose Gold and Red Film, but also I'm curious how it relates to photography for you, and for that matter, language, because they all seem to be interestingly democratized within the context of that, of certainly soft film.
Yeah, I mean, I love the detail about you watching soft film 100 times. There must be so many, I think there are so many different experiences of the film. Every time I watch it, I remember some different connection. And yeah, the film started with this male voice of authority narrator. I actually cast for a male voice of authority, and I wanted someone who sounded like an encyclopedia. And I wanted it to be this kind of conversation around image culture and around value, and the kind of arbitrariness of values. So why, for example, an object from eBay might seem important to one person or worth $5 and worth $50 to someone else. And then what those kind of choices and biases can kind of tell us about larger facets of our culture, like what we find valuable in kind of other contexts and in relationship to our interpersonal dynamics too. So I was kind of trying to use these objects that I was finding on eBay of outmoded jewelry boxes and use them as vessels to talk about power and misogyny and image culture, and the way that images kind of seduce us into thinking that some things or some people or some parts of history or some versions of our world are important and others are not, which are huge topics that are kind of almost impossible to talk about. So I try to start small and start with the particular and hope that it kind of opens into these larger conversations. And yeah, I've used the same voice actor over and over because of his amazing kind of voice that sounds like a historical record in a very almost cartoonish version of that. And then I always end up correcting him or making it clear who's actually speaking.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me that that easily could be edited out of the final film, but it's kept in, I think, very intentionally. The level of intentionality of that correction of pronunciation of palimpsest, which is actually a huge idea within the film itself, really does sort of set the power akimbo, if you will. It's this male voice of authority who is very early on in the film. I think after the first use of the term "a soft misogyny" is sort of corrected. And that, again, was where my fascination kind of began, because I think I am drawn, like a lot of people, to kitsch, and I also find it weirdly repellent. And I think that you use it to its utmost potential. And I'm kind of curious about what you think of your relation to kitsch, because it seems very present yet ambiguous.
Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking about kitsch since I was an undergrad. I made a book called Kitsch Encyclopedia that most people haven't seen now. It's kind of, it doesn't exist in very many copies, but that first sort of outlined my idea of what kitsch could mean as related to image culture and to kind of saving an archive of images and working from those, which is how I work. And I guess I've talked about this a lot, but I think about kitsch in terms of Milan Kundera's definition in The Unbearable Lightness of Being, which is a book that I don't even know if it's that good of a book, but this one part where he talks about kitsch kind of being about seeing with the collective eye and about kind of being not about what you're seeing, but about how you think you're supposed to see what you're seeing. So the kind of central illustration of that is like seeing children playing on the grass and thinking, how nice to see children playing on the grass. But then there's this second layer where you go, how nice to be moved together with all of mankind by this image of children playing on the grass. And that's what makes kitsch, is the idea that you're kind of seeing according to a preset notion of what you're supposed to be moved by, what you're supposed to think is worth looking at, how you're supposed to look at things. And we all have this in mind. And I think these ideas become harder to pin down, obviously, with the internet, and more relevant. And yeah, so that version of kitsch I kind of try to play with in lots of different ways. I guess I'm more interested in kitsch images and in the way the world gets kind of distilled down to these oversimplified, often nostalgic images, more so than a kind of traditional kitsch object that maybe is more what people think about when they think about kitsch, like kind of ironically appreciated products of popular culture, tchotchkes. Those are less interesting to me, although I certainly have a lot of those in my work, than the kind of image version of kitsch, and this idea that there's a like second layer of the world that we live through in our images, and that this kind of obscures what's happening in reality. And again, I'm trying to talk about these things using actual objects and images and to kind of ground them in something, because they're really hard to put your finger on.
Yeah, it strikes me as a definitive tool that isn't overused. So the point of any given work is not the kitsch within it, but rather kitsch is employed with a certain cadence. And I think that it's a tool to make the work lean toward this, I guess, egalitarianism. Or at least that's the way I read it. But I love, kitsch is often associated with lack of restraint, and you do the exact opposite. You employ it with the utmost restraint, and that makes it an interesting tool in your work for me. And also just the, speaking of cadence, just the sheer volume of kitsch items. Part of that is just quite literally the sheer volume, and then also the editing, the way the films are edited. There becomes this kind of, you get definitely, it allows this lens that refers to the tsunami of objects that we now live amid, and even more so, the tsunami of images. And that's what's interesting actually about both soft film, rose gold, and red film to me. They all kind of address this thing that I think about all the time, almost to the point of a kind of fear, which is that no object or picture has any real value anymore, because we live in an ongoing cascade of them. We live in an object-heavy culture, and we certainly live in an image-heavy culture. And I think the films address that concern, at least of mine, really effectively.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's something I've been thinking about more and more in my newer work too. Like the idea that everything is just immediately replaced by something else, that we're kind of living in these circles of things that just keep replacing one another, and we could grab any of them and one thing wouldn't be more important than the last thing. And how are we supposed to know what's kind of true or real or important within those cycles? And especially red film tried to think about a kind of feeling of endless choice that we live in, that's not really about a choice that anyone would actually want. So you can choose different colors of commodities, or you can choose different ways of writing the same caption on your Instagram, or you can choose, a certain number of filters or ways of kind of reproducing yourself according to the dictates of the technologies that we increasingly have to reproduce ourselves within. Like I think of Instagram or Facebook, depending what age bracket and location you're in, I guess. But I'm trying to kind of get at the feeling of sort of thinking you're choosing, but not really having a choice. And then also the kind of pleasure in that, like how we could be really cynical and sad about it, but also there is some kind of pleasure in using these tools that are available to us, as like, even though we're kind of operating according to the dictates of markets and of surveillance capitalism, I guess, which is a term that I've been thinking about a lot. We find a way to like experience some freedom within that and to make it our own. And especially, I think millennials and Generation Z people are really good at that. Like they know how to have confidence within these realms, and they're not just getting used by them, but it's really tricky and hard to kind of stay on top of everything that we're kind of inundated with, like you said. yeah, I don't know. It's hard to even talk about, but I'm trying to make these films that make you feel like you're in this like endless choice that's not a choice at all, and even the ways of talking about it are kind of pre-decided on. And for example, I was thinking a lot about these kind of Instagram captions I was reading over and over again, where they're written with a little bit of sass and with like some power, but also always written in the same way. And they'll have a bit of a manifesto vibe, and they're sort of maybe a little bit self-aware of the fact that they're being written for a corporation, but not self-aware enough to not be doing it. And there's a kind of like, I don't know, the way that the people have absorbed the technologies and then kind of regurgitate them, and how that's constantly shifting is endlessly interesting to me as well.
Things you didn't even know you wanted.
The way that the things that were the most stylish are the ones to warp the most quickly. And what about value? Take this one again.
Video is the perfect medium for this, because as soon as one thought ends, another can replace it, and you can kind of be in a chaotic world that feels like it mimics this feeling of the scroll or of the endless choice of things that we're living in. And also the way that like you'll be in a hum of regular information, and then it's suddenly punctuated with something much more disturbing or much more beautiful or much more important. And then as soon as you figure out what's important, that gets replaced by something else.
I find these pictures from South Korea in the 70s. A Kenyan businessman is passing through a new factory building. The woman gets me. She only appears sometimes. What happened after? I wasn't able to find out much, this is South Korea. What I know.
Yeah, the scroll is a really interesting signifier in all of this for me, because the films, in my estimation, sort of emulate the idea of the scroll without it literally being a scroll. And I would have referred to it as a kind of parade, or a presentation that has a definitive cadence. And which is interesting also because all the films are relatively short. So from beginning to end, you have this really very edited, fast experience that makes you feel like you have been, for me anyway, quite literally buried in these objects. And then it's over. And then you watch it again, or at least I do. And that's a really interesting thing for me. The fact that it could kind of go on endlessly, but there is a intentional, succinct quality to it. And I'm curious, given that, if you have more films like this in mind, or any in production. Is there more work like soft film, rose gold, or red film coming?
Yeah, I just made a film called Glass Life, which does take its title from Shoshana Zuboff's The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, which is a term she comes up with or brings into the book at the very end, to describe both the kind of fragility of our connections and our sense of ourselves within digital worlds, but also the way that we're kind of living as if behind glass, always being seen. Her idea is that without the possibility for privacy and for to be able to kind of exit the world and figure out who we are and what matters to us outside of the kind of tentacles of technology, we can no longer access ourselves or what we think is important, or again, what is true or real, or, you know, you could kind of expand on what she might mean, but that it's very difficult to know what we even think without having any privacy. And so I made this new film that tries to kind of take this idea and scrolls through. Actually, it does have a physical scroll kind of feeling to it.
Yeah.
It scrolls through a set. It kind of zooms into different materials, and then other channels play those zooms out for longer as the main scroll just keeps going in this kind of relentless parade or march through a set of videos, and it's like personal clips, there's Margaret Thatcher, there's protest footage, there's vintage YouTube videos. There's a lot of things that I have shot for other projects and not used. It's kind of like a personal archive film, but also trying to connect to this idea of glass life and to a larger kind of political undertone that kind of that informs why we might be saving and showing and looking at this kind of endless scroll of both personal and public imagery. And yeah, I wanted it to kind of also be about the arbitrariness of it all, like the kind of connections that come up when you have so much material, and the way that we are all making these giant archives that we'll never have time to go back and address again, or to bring meaningfully to bear on our actual lives, and what this means and how it feels to be sort of impelled to collect and to save in the same way that we feel impelled to reproduce ourselves through social media. We also kind of are all making these archives, and none of us really know what they mean, or that's how I feel. So I'm trying to kind of make projects now that that show some of that, but that also get at the feeling of kind of trying to control some sort of chaos and failing. And yeah, it kind of takes on a similar tone to the other films, but is much more immersive and maybe much more chaotic, I think.
Yeah, that was actually, when I started that question, it was sort of my clumsy segue into Glass Life, which was really fascinating to me. And I think it's because, in part, I had recently watched Stanya Khan Standing in the River, which also is this kind of cascade of information, but hers is tethered to her life in a way that social media isn't tethered to anyone's life. Like, basically, her mother will show up periodically in the film, or her children will show up periodically, and not, amid good vacations and Labrador retrievers, but rather the funk of her life is more present and kind of shapes the film more. And which is not to say that I think the two films are similar at all, except in this regard that they both, I think, cast a critical eye at really not even the fiction of social media, but the lie of social media. And with this kind of avalanche of information, both oral and visual, and in your case, language as well. One of the things that happens in social media that is really, really weird to me is how you can palpably see the death of language occurring within it. The language attached to all this imagery is horrible, and it's as if we don't know how to write or speak anymore. And I'm curious if that's a thought when you're putting, because I think language is really interestingly paired to your imagery, and I wonder if you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking in the script for Glass Life sort of both about what your opinions would be if they were a collage of think pieces and kind of snippets of Instagram clips, and this kind of particular type of opinion piece or think piece that maybe all kind of liberal thinking people read 500 of every month now, it feels like. Or to me, it felt like we kind of removed ourselves from the world and then re-entered it through the lens of a certain number of media sources that all kind of say the same thing. And I agree with some of them, but it becomes, to me, it became a bit like stultifying to be kind of constantly reading reformulations of the same thing. I mean, that's been a critique of the media forever, I guess. But in this moment of COVID and of disconnection from the actual world, it felt particularly notable how everyone's opinions were sort of a collage of the same think pieces, or that's how I started to feel. And my own opinions were becoming that too, or that was my fear. So I wanted to make this script that kind of maybe clarified some of that language, or I don't know if it does, and I don't necessarily expect a reader to kind of get this from it, but it sort of is written like this like word salad of think pieces that feel both very current and very much like the way we've always talked about these things in certain political spheres. And then it also pulls from other more kind of aphoristic sources like advertising and some classic image theory. There's always some Walter Benjamin in everything I make, and always some Flusser. And I have my favorite people, and I also try to kind of question them within the text and not to hold these people up too much, even though I love them. And it's kind of like
I'm wondering, you mentioned, actually, he's referenced in Saw film, and he was a Harlem Renaissance photographer that used drapery. His name is now escaping me for some reason. Do you remember?
Oh my God, Carl Van Vechten.
Yeah, Carl Van Vechten. It was interesting. That was the other thing, because I had been, when I first saw the film, I was talking with Paul Sepoya, who also uses Van Vechten as this kind of reference point. And I think really the films are tethered to the idea of your photography in a very interesting way, in that they consider what a picture can be right now, especially a picture that is art, which is a hard thing to think about, because I think for the most part, photography has turned into using the camera as an aestheticizing machine, and you do what it might be considered the opposite of that. And I think Paul Sepoya actually does what might be considered the opposite of that, which is not make a photograph this beautiful representation of whatever it is in your gaze. And the films operate that way as well. There's a kind of there's a little sand in them. There's a little funk, and I'm curious about how you gather all of these images. I'm quite literally curious about how you live with them. If you want to know the truth, like how are they in your house? It's just a thing that I'm personally interested in. Are they in plastic bins, or do you have flat files full of images? How does it work?
I'm not so organized to have flat files. I have tons of plastic bins. Like it's all very chaotic, and then I will kind of look for one thing and find 10 other things, and that's partly how I make stuff, is through the random connections that come up even within my own kind of closed set of things that I'm working with. For the Performa commission that we talked about, the Down at the Arcade project, I did label hundreds of these images and objects so I could send them down a conveyor belt under a camera, and they could come down come under the camera as the voiceover was speaking about them. So there could be this kind of like real-time connection. So for the first time, I had to go through bins and bins of this stuff and put a number on each one, which I had a team of 5 people helping me with, and it took a really long time. And now I think I'll just take the labels off and put them back into their mashup bins that they were in before. I don't know if I'll ever kind of get a full grasp on my collection of stuff, and I don't know if it would be good for me. I feel like I like the way Andy Warhol talked about collecting as a way of kind of staving off death, or he was very dramatic about why people might save or try to make a physical archive or version of themselves in the world. And I subscribe to that notion a little bit and think that if I ever got it all organized, I'd just be done. So I need to like keep the chaos of my collection always in motion a little bit. And yeah, I just have bins and bins of stuff, and I accumulate more and more. And I moved to a bigger studio 2 years ago, and I've already filled that studio. It's kind of like how a fish grows to the size of its fish bowl or something. Every time I get a bigger studio, I just like fill it with more stuff. Yeah, and I really hate Marie Kondo or anyone who tries to tell you that it's somehow better to live with no stuff. I do not feel that way, but yeah.
No, it certainly is not conducive to your practice. And I know that Warhol collected a lot of things, odd things, cookie jars and things like that. And I do think that it sort of entered his work. And I do, I'm curious, though, if you consider these objects that you gather that become the vocabulary of your work as collections. I had a professor in grad school who insisted that everyone collects something, whether you're consciously doing it or not. And I suddenly became aware of what it is that I collect, and then have since that time tuned in almost immediately when I enter somebody's home to the thing that I think that they collect. But I again would love to imagine your home again filled with these things that fill the films, or at least your studio. Maybe that's the more sane way to think about it. And I'm glad that you mentioned Performa, because really all I've seen of Performa to this point are stills of the performance. So this idea that it sounds to me as if it replicates the way the films operate through quite literally a conveyor belt, which is a really interesting way to think about that. A conveyor belt on which things are photographed. So really there's, I suppose, a reference to the scroll there as well.
Yeah. Yeah, it was like a kind of real-time scroll or real-time word image connections, and then sort of what happens if the thing is actually there and doesn't just disappear into this digital ether, but like falls off the conveyor belt and starts making piles and becomes a mess. And so it was kind of about the unruliness of actual things if one actually had to contend with them, and also the kind of beauty and satisfaction of them. Like, I think there was something really just satisfying about watching, like you used the word parade before. It was sort of a parade of things that one wouldn't expect to see paraded down an aisle with a bunch of people watching them, like a ball of yarn or an old perfume bottle. And yeah, I think it worked. It was a big experiment. But I think there was something about kind of having to deal with the things in the actual world that changed it a lot in a way that's really exciting to me. And there were also aspects, like in the films, where I was correcting the narrator. I used the same voice again. And I was sort of sitting there speaking back to him. And I think that also had a very different effect in real life. I'm still not sure what the whole thing was. Like, it was, yeah, I was very much in the middle of it, performing it, directing it, and I still don't, yeah, I feel like I'll know what it was in a year.
Well, you're just on the other side of it. When did perform? Yeah. When was it? It was literally days ago.
It was
right?
2 weeks ago. Yeah,
okay.
It's been 2 weeks. And it was 3 performances, and I felt like the second one was the best one. And I really, like, everything synced. Like, it was also made around a whole bunch of timing things that all had to kind of sync up and happen according to the voiceover that just played. So it wasn't like there was much room for the images or the objects to not come in when they were supposed to. So it was kind of also just a big experiment of, like, setting off cues and having this image come in at this moment and this word match this image, and then watching it all sort of fall apart and the way the world never matches up to your plan. And I think at its best, it kind of had a feeling of trying to control something and never quite being able to. That also feels really true to a lot of the themes of my work. And yeah, I think it was exciting. I would like to do more performance. I might not want to be the star again, but
well, you can do the Anne Hamilton thing of hiring some semi-sentient person to do the performative thing in your work, perhaps. But it looked really fascinating to me, and it actually made me think about. I was looking at the images this morning, and it made me think about the use of the conveyor belt, especially as a comedic trope. Everything from Curious George to Lucille Ball has used this idea of the conveyor belt never stopping. And as we all know, every conveyor belt has an end at which, when things are out of control, there is a kind of entropic accumulation of whatever it is that's being moved. And when I finally tuned into the fact that that might have been what was going on at Performa, I think I might have laughed out loud. And I would actually, I don't know if there's footage of that, but I would at some point love to see it.
Yeah.
And speaking of which, that would be great. And speaking of surveillance economy, that noise before was an Amber Alert. My phone knows that I have children and wants me to be afraid somehow. Sorry. Well, it's been really great talking to you, and I appreciate your time, and I really do appreciate the work and your sharing it with us. It's been the reaction to the work here has been really overwhelmingly great, and part of that is that people, generally speaking, have never seen anything quite like it. And so it also allowed me to direct probably upward near 100 people to go watch the other films, to sort of the soft film has sort of context for everybody. So as people were walking out of our video gallery, I was directing them to your other work just to kind of build this context. And we were very, very honored to show it. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for showing it. It actually hasn't been shown that much, so it's exciting.
It's it is among my favorite things. So
thank you.
I really do appreciate your time, though, and thank you very much.
Thank you.